China is a peer to the United States. Mr. President of the United States have clearly articulated such an image. What more could Beijing have wanted?
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And then Daddy has to sometimes do strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, 3rd of November, 2025. Last week saw Donald Trump on a pomp-filled tour of Eastern Asia. He presided over the signing of the Thailand-Cambodia peace deal while attending the high-level ASEAN meeting in Malaysia. When he got to Japan, Tokyo Tower was turned the colours of the US flag, and he was given 250 cherry trees as a present. And finally, South Korea welcomed him with a military band playing Hail to the Chief and YMCA, followed by gifts that included a replica of an ancient crown, a medal, and a gold-encrusted peace brownie. All in all, he was treated like a king, and it made for some very nice visuals. He even had a much-watched meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping that he said was hugely successful.
We're going to issue a statement on some of the details. But overall, I guess on the scale of from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, I would say the meeting was a 12.
But how significant was this trip, really, beyond all the spectacle and ceremony? What did we learn about Trump and Xi's relationship from their first meeting in 6 years? Were the rare earth and critical mineral deals that Trump struck enough to protect Western militaries from China's stranglehold on this key industry? And what does this visit say about the US's ability to contain an increasingly confident Beijing in the Indo-Pacific? To answer all of that, I'm joined by Ben Bland, Director of the Asia-Pacific Programme at Chatham House, and Steve Tsang, Director of the SOAS China Institute. Ben, Steve, welcome to Battle Lines. So I want to start by talking about this Trump-Xi meeting, and I want to begin with a quick-fire question, if that's okay. He rated the success of the talks 12 out of 10. What would you guys give it?
I think it depends if you're scoring for China or the US or the rest of the world. I would say it's a 7 for China, a 2 for America, and probably a 4 for the rest of the world.
Steve, what do you think?
I think 7 for China sounds about right. China did get quite a lot of what it wants without actually paying much of a price. For the rest of the world, I will give it a bit more. I would say probably 5. For the United States, I think ranking it really depending on where you actually stand rather than where it actually is. And the reality is that by Trump ranking it 12 out of 10, he is giving Xi Jinping more reasons to rank it more successfully than otherwise. And that is probably the slight difference between Ben ranking it only 7, I would give it 8, because I'm taking much more of a Xi Jinping approach of another gift from Donald Trump. Thank you very much, my old friend, would have been the kind of sentiments from Xi Jinping.
Okay, fair enough. That's a really good basis to start off this talk with. Let's just think a little bit about the optics first. Trump and Xi handshake, which went on for nearly a minute. Xi standing there looking quite sort of stony-faced, not straying off the script. Trump trying to make lovely comments. Oh, he's such a hard negotiator. Ha, ha, ha. What were your overall impressions of the visuals of the meeting?
We are looking at a projection of an image of the President of the United States being very, very keen to be nice to the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, with the leader of the Chinese Communist Party behaving in a very professional, matter-of-fact way. And so, if you really want to project an image from the Chinese perspective of which side appear more like a supplicant, Donald Trump has won hands down, again presenting the United States as a bit of a supplicant. But of course, given the actual power balance between China and the United States, the US is not the supplicant. So it ends up projecting the image which Xi Jinping would have loved to have secured, which is that at the moment we are in a world of a G2, that China is a peer to the United States. Mr. President of the United States have clearly articulated such an image. What more could Beijing have wanted?
Ben?
China comes out pretty well. Senior Chinese officials would have been really nervous about this moment. If you think about within China and on the international stage generally, Xi Jinping's presence is very carefully stage managed. China is a one-party state with full control over its own media, its own social media. So there aren't many situations where he can be surprised. He can be shown off guard. So I think there was a lot of talks beforehand about this meeting between China and the US to try and ensure he wouldn't be embarrassed. Obviously, the Chinese leadership would have been aware of what happened to Zelensky when he went to Washington. They would have been aware about Keir Starmer, Mark Carney being shown up by Trump. So I think the way it turned out would have been pretty good for China in the end. This sense, as Steve was saying, of parity between these two countries, even though the US in many ways is still in the lead. So I think that, number one, but also number two, that there were no embarrassing moments, because I think that would have been the greater fear in a sense.
So parity, but not much warmth, right? We often hear Trump, when he's speaking about Xi, he speaks quite warmly of him. He seems to like him, even if he is in the same sentence accusing China of having a stranglehold over America's economy. What does Xi think of Trump? Do we have any idea? Is that ever covered in Chinese press in any kind of substantive way?
Well, I think you're completely right. Donald Trump clearly respects and in some ways admires Xi Jinping. He would probably have been quite happy if he could have the kind of power Xi Jinping enjoys in China. Now, Xi Jinping knows that. And he clearly does not reciprocate. He does not feel the same towards Donald Trump. He does not have a sense of warmth towards Donald Trump. It's reflected in the body language. But he is very much aware that Donald Trump is somebody he has to work with. He has to handle Donald Trump very carefully in order to get his way. And this kind of goes back to the point that Ben has underlined, and I think very rightly too, which is that the Chinese government has known for a long time that the trump card they have in dealing with Trump is Xi Jinping. And yet, the Chinese have held back playing the Xi card until now, when they were pretty certain in the pre-meetings that happened that the Trump administration would be making significant concessions to find a way forward, and therefore with practically no risk to Xi Jinping being embarrassed.
Just to add, I think there's a big disconnect here in time horizons, right? So when Donald Trump uses flattery to try and boost the outcomes of a meeting, he's thinking about the next hour, the next update on Truth Social, the next day's press headlines, what's going to be on Fox News or CNN, rolling news that day. That's about it. But I think China and many other countries, when they're meeting the US, are thinking much more long term, and they understand that Donald Trump's personality and his explicit style is to be unpredictable. So I think on the one hand, Trump is thinking about how to get through this meeting looking good. Of course, in China, they're somewhat concerned about that, but the much bigger concern is how to manage the relationship with the US over the rest of Donald Trump's term, with future presidents, etc. So I think that also explains this differentiation. And Trump is obviously overvaluing his ability to use his personality to get long-term wins for the US. I think on the Chinese side, they understand that they can use the personal politics for some short-term advantage, but the long-term competition between the US and China is not going to be determined by Donald Trump's personality or his desire for a sort of short-term media or social media win.
We'll get onto that bigger picture later in our chat. For now, in terms of what actually came out of those talks, from a defence perspective, the most significant is probably the agreement over rare earths, where China agreed to delay by a year its most recent export restrictions from October, and I believe roll back from the ones that it imposed in April. How significant is this?
I think how significant that is will depend on what happened in the next 12 months. Xi Jinping agreed to it. In fact, probably relatively easily, because the recent additional restrictions over rare earth export was introduced precisely as a negotiating lever to use when dealing with Donald Trump. So it was not something that he was necessarily intending to keep anyway. And he is doing it to buy 1 year in order for China to upskill its capacity in producing advanced chips and reduce or indeed eliminate Chinese dependence on the US on critical technologies like advanced chips. And he knows he has a system that will focus on delivering that in the next 12 months. Now, does the United States, with a president who is the greatest master in alienating American allies and partners, be able to work with partners and allies and with the US administration, which is at the moment not functioning, to deliver the capacity for the United States and associates to produce the capacity for refining rare earth in the next 12 months and eliminate US and European and other democracies' dependence on China for rare earth. So the bet from Beijing's perspective is that it's a pretty good bet for them and good for Donald Trump to agree to it and thinking that it's a big win for Donald Trump. They don't mind Donald Trump presenting it as a big win because they know they are more likely to actually come out top.
Ben, that's a good point because Trump also signed deals with Malaysia, Thailand, Japan over rare earths, and it signed another deal with Australia a couple of weeks back following China's October export restrictions. Is any of this enough, really, to break China's stranglehold on this key industry?
Well, the important thing to understand is that China produces more than 90% of most of the world's rare earth minerals, which aren't rare themselves, but what's rare is having the investment and being willing to absorb the pollution to process the rare earths into these minerals, which go into many of the key electronic products we use every day. And for that reason, they're also crucial to our military and defense supply chains, which are obviously increasingly dependent on advanced electronics. So this has been a big problem because of the fear and then I guess the reality earlier this year of China saying it's going to withhold access to these minerals. So in the short term, the fact that the supply will keep moving will be a relief for businesses, for military contractors, etc. But I think to Steve's point, I think it reduces the chances, to be honest, of other countries developing alternatives to China, because if you're going to have long-term collaboration between the US and its allies and other countries, including Malaysia, on alternative sources of the processing of rare earths, you need certainty for businesses. You need regulatory certainty. You need a huge amount of investment. And having this constant topsy-turvy relationship with China on again, off again, makes it really hard for certainty for business. It makes it really hard for governments to collaborate on alternatives. And I think to Steve's point about allies, it gives allies the sense that they may try and be on board with the US push for alternatives, but at any moment under the current administration, they could pull out basically and cut their own deal with China, which is what's happened here. So I think it's really bad for the long-term future of developing alternatives to China.
One of the reasons that relations have been so topsy-turvy this year is because of Trump's tariff war, his trade war. A number of other things were agreed at the talks to do with fentanyl, precursors, soybeans, and lots of other bits and bobs that we don't need to get into. But effectively, I'm curious to know, is this the end of the trade war now?
It's a truce.
Definitely not.
It's a truce and definitely not. Steve, you go first.
It's a truce, and we are dealing with two leaders who make promises and they can change their mind. Neither can be relied on that if they have made a promise to any kind of agreement, they will stick to the terms as it was agreed. They will stick to the terms as they like to think what the terms are, and that can change. So I think the idea that the whole thing has now been done is a bit overstated. Whether when Trump goes to Beijing in April or in the spring, an agreement will actually be signed, that remains to be seen. I think it is a possibility. But again, Beijing has been very, very clear in how they approach this kind of issues. They do not want Xi Jinping to go to Washington first. They want Trump to go to Beijing first so that they are completely in control of the environment and the narrative and how the negotiations are to be conducted. And they are very mindful that the last time Donald Trump went to Beijing and was hosted by Xi Jinping, they pulled out what we jokingly call a super state visit. And it was so much butter being applied that Donald Trump forgot to say what he was meant to say in Beijing until he got to Hanoi and then said, oh, I had meant to say this in Beijing, but forgot. If we end up with an agreement in the spring when Xi Jinping received Donald Trump in Beijing, the Chinese would expect to get an agreement that would be quite favorable to them.
Ben, you said absolutely not. Go on.
Well, look, everyone always says that Trump's unpredictable, but actually in many ways that's not true at all, right? There are certain things that we know about him, and being interested in the use of tariffs and trade wars is something that's very deep-seated in Donald Trump's psyche, so I don't think that's going to go away. Number two, that we know his personality is very fickle. He tends to listen and be persuaded by the last person he spoke to, and he tends to change his mind depending on what's in the news. That's not going to change. And thirdly, and linked to that, we know he actively uses unpredictability as a tactic for negotiation, right? Which adds further unpredictability layered on his own personality. So I think for all that, this could all fall apart within days. We know that. Something could happen that irks him. He puts out an angry message on Truth Social and the whole thing falls apart. Equally, it might stay in place for a while longer, but I don't think these broader trends in how Trump sees the world will change. But, you know, it is possible, we have to say, that the truce between China and the US may hold, because the last thing I'll say on Trump is he doesn't actually believe particularly deeply in competition with China. In the US political establishment and military establishment, there's this sense that the US faces this existential battle with China as the number two rising superpower that they feel wants to displace it. Donald Trump doesn't think about China like that. He thinks about it as an economic challenge, but potentially as an economic opportunity if he can do the right deal. So I think there's potential here for China to play Trump and somehow keep him on side. But I think it's unlikely that that will hold given his character and his approach to the world, as well as China's.
Is that worldview that you just mentioned, do you think that's why Taiwan didn't come up in these talks? Were either of you surprised by that, Ben? I'm
not surprised because A, it gets to this point of China not wanting to be embarrassed. And they know that Trump is very incautious with his use of words, his use of language. So by putting Taiwan on the table, they risk egg on their face, I think. If he says something that really looks bad, it's a very high-risk topic. And I think for Trump himself, he does understand, while I don't think he's that interested in the details of Taiwan's self-governance and the complicated sort of linguistic and political position that the US has towards Taiwan and China, he does know that it's a very sensitive and complicated issue. And if you're going to put that on the table with China again, it makes it harder for him to come away with something he can claim to US voters who don't really care about Taiwan, by the way. It's harder for him to claim to them a victory if they've had these really tense conversations about Taiwan. So I think that was probably, you know, a good thing on both sides from the point of view of having an agreement that they can reach. Let's put the more toxic issues aside for now and try and talk about something where there's maybe more middle ground and less risk.
Well, obviously, I have no inside information as to what actually happened. But my reading of the situation would be that it didn't happen. Taiwan was not mentioned because Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, had played his part. Before the Trump-Xi meeting, we know that Rubio had in the pre-meetings with the Chinese make it clear that the US side did not want the Taiwan issue to be put on the agenda. Now, from the Chinese government's perspective, if you are going to be preparing for Xi Jinping's visit, then you will apply what Ben has just basically said. If you are not sure you are going to get a response from Trump on Taiwan that would be what Xi Jinping wanted, then you are better off not raising it rather than spring it on as a surprise to Donald Trump and get a response that you just don't know which way it's going to go. If all goes well, good for you. You keep your job. If it does not go the way that Beijing would want, that Xi Jinping would want, think about the potential consequences to you as an advisor to Xi Jinping and getting him into a situation that Xi Jinping would not want to be in. And I think that's probably why Taiwan didn't get mentioned at all.
The meeting with Xi was obviously at the end of a whistle-stop tour around Asia. He went to South Korea, Malaysia and Japan. What else was significant that he agreed on here? We've discussed rare earths. What else stuck out to you?
I think it's good he showed up. right? I think we have to give him credit for that. US presidents don't always show up at the key regional meetings. So in Malaysia, there was a summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is the backbone for all the broader diplomatic and security architecture in Asia. And many US presidents in the past, including when they've said that Asia and the Indo-Pacific is a key objective for engagement, haven't shown up at these summits. And it's really important to regional partners for the US to be present at the highest levels. So I think it's good he showed up. I think it's good that Trump played a part, or maybe a small part, in helping ensure that Thailand and Cambodia de-escalated from their violent clashes over the border dispute earlier this year. I think he did play a marginal but positive role there. And I think it's good that he had positive discussions with the new leaders in Japan and South Korea, who are two of the most important US allies in the region. There's a lot of fear in Japan and South Korea, as in the UK and any other US ally, about abandonment, about Trump's more isolationist instincts, these points he keeps making about partners having to fend for themselves. So I think they were glad that he showed up, that they also had constructive conversations about defense cooperation, economic cooperation, etc. I think that the concerns there will be the ability, as we discussed already, for Trump to change his mind. And I think the other question is these so-called trade deals and investment deals that Trump reached with Japan and Korea and other partners, where there were these very wide-ranging pledges on the part of Asian governments to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the US. So is that realistic? Will that materialize? And also, how will their publics, especially in these big democracies like Japan and South Korea, feel about their governments pumping huge amounts of their taxpayers' money potentially to help US voters rather than their own voters? And I think this is one of the challenges that leaders of US allies, including in the UK, to face, right? So the closer they try to get to the US president to keep the US on side, the greater the fears in our own societies that our leaders are selling us out at a time when our governments are really fiscally constrained and we have our own concerns about jobs and growth and investment to benefit the US. And I think, again, that gets back to this world we're in that becomes much more and more beggar thy neighbor rather than a sense of allies being able to cooperate in a win-win situation, as the Chinese would put it.
I think the point that the new leaders in Japan and in South Korea were pleased that they could be reassured that the relationship with the United States was on an even keel was important to them. The fact that Trump went to Southeast Asia, to Malaysia in particular, was a positive because they have been so neglected. But has it changed anything? I think that, to me, is the really big question. And I don't think it has changed much of anything. We are talking about a very low bar of America's key allies and potential partners in the region not feeling being abandoned or being excessively bullied by the United States, when they should be looking at how they could actually be working with the United States to confront some of the issues that they share in common, which are involving China on the other side. That's simply not happening. So for Trump to achieve what he, in a sense, really needed to achieve, which is to substantially strengthen relationship with potential and key allies in the Asia-Pacific, that did not happen. He just didn't blow things up.
We're going to take a brief pause now, and coming up after the break, how much of a security threat is China in the Pacific and beyond? Welcome back. Before we continue with this chat, I wanted to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review. You can comment underneath this episode on Spotify or YouTube, or go to the main podcast feed on Apple. We love to hear what you like and what you don't like, so we can make the show tailored to your interests. Right, back to the conversation with Steve and Ben. So Trump left before the main APEC meeting, right? And this was a big opportunity. It was attended by major leaders of countries representing something like 60% of the world's GDP. And Xi was just left to take centre stage. And this really felt to me like a metaphor for Trump's policy in the Pacific. It's unpredictable, it's transactional, it's all show, no substance, not putting in the hard graft. And meanwhile, China is quietly getting on with this hard work of investing, building its influence, being seen as a reliable partner. What do you think? Do you agree, or how would you characterize Trump's policy in the Pacific?
I would agree, but it's not just about what I think. I think the important thing is when I talk to senior leaders in Asia, what they say is if you're talking about which superpower is destabilizing the world, is behaving in an unpredictable way, is bullying, is potentially threatening to our national security, unfortunately, more and more they would say that is the USA these days, not China. Doesn't mean that they don't have their own challenge with China as well. And an important point to remember here is the world and Asia isn't based on a kind of seesaw between the US and China when the US is down, so China is up and vice versa. We're in a much more complicated world where it's quite possible to be frustrated by and threatened by the US and China at the same time. In theory, it's possible to have good relations with both. But I think while no one in China's neighborhood would say that it's an easy regional leader, of course, China is a bully at times. It uses its economic power, its military power, its political power to coerce other countries. But I think what neighbors would say is that China is quite predictable. Partners know what China wants. They know what their red line issues are. They know where they can work with China. They know where it's hard. But the US right now is just very, very unpredictable. So I think that makes it really difficult. And I think China as a one-party dictatorship has never really relied on trust and credibility for its global positioning, really. That's a sort of nice to have if people tend to trust it or think it's predictable. But the US presents itself as the shining city on a hill, this leader of this alliance of democracies that offers a different kind of credibility, predictability, a different, better world. So I think for the US to be losing this image that it once had is much more damaging. While in some ways the US is still easier to cooperate with than China, actually the US is losing one of its own long-held superpowers. And China, in a sense, is supporting its presence that, well, you may not like everything we do, but we've always told you what we care about, what we like, what we don't like, and you can do business with us on that basis. And as I said earlier, for businesses in particular, and most leaders in the region, their focus is jobs, growth, investment. For businesses, they want the sort of predictability that China offers them.
For the member states of APEC, other than the United States and China, what they want is that they do not end up being torn between the US and China. There is a reality of geography. From your APEC member states, which are physically in the Asia-Pacific side, China is a reality. It matters not whether China is friendly or bullying or what. China is a reality. China is here to stay. The United States is a strong, incredibly strong and important presence in the region by choice, even though it has been the reality since the end of the Second World War. But the US can pull back. And that is something that I think leaders of your countries in the region know instinctively well. And they need from the United States much stronger commitment that the United States is here for the long haul and is reliable and trustworthy as allies for them to have any reasons to work with the United States. And Trump did not deliver that. So you put those countries in a situation that they have to think about China, accepting that China is the lead player there. And with Xi Jinping presenting or projecting that China is a positive force in the region, they don't really have much of a choice but pretend that they actually are working with the Chinese. And that is not what would be in the best interest of countries in the region as a whole or for the United States itself. But that is where we are. Donald Trump aims to make America great again, but more often than not, he delivers a result which is to make China great again.
Ben, would you agree?
I think it depends on what Trump's focus really is. I don't actually think Trump wants the US to be great in the sense of being everywhere in the world and being the sort of global policeman that it once was. I think his view of a great America is much more limited, isolationist, focused on America's near abroad. It's interesting. A lot of his actual moves have been focused on Greenland, Latin America, Canada. So I think in his sense, he is moving towards making America great again. But I think that's certainly on the global field of geopolitics and economics is leaving room for China to look like the more responsible, predictable power, even though that's not necessarily always the case. So I certainly think Donald Trump's presidency has been a win for China. But I think in the longer term, China's positioning in the world will come much more down to what China does, how the Chinese Communist Party leads. So there's a short-term win, but in the longer term, the US looking bad isn't enough for China to look good. As I said, the world is more complicated than that. So I think there's still a long way to go to see where this ends up.
The traditional security architecture in the Indo-Pacific was dominated by this US-led hub and spoke system, all these bilateral alliances established after the Korean War. That's all changing now, and that was initially established to counter communist influence. What is the threat that America is now trying to build alliances to protect against? Can you guys spell it out for us?
I think this is a really, really important and not well understood enough issue, to be honest, right? I think the US as a superpower, like many powers, they need an external enemy to rally their own society, to rally their economy, to rally their companies. And particularly because the US has always been this kind of messianic nation, right? This is the way they've organized their geopolitics and the domestic politics. The problem in the world today is there isn't really a rival that represents the same threat that global communism represented throughout the Cold War. If you think about it, the Soviet Union was a global ideological challenger to the US and to US of capitalist democracy. They fought these proxy wars all around the world. There was also an internal threat of subversion. So you had this combination of the global threat, the regional threat, and the internal threat. China isn't really an internal threat to the US. There aren't many sort of ideological fellow travelers for the Chinese Communist Party within the US. China's not really a global ideological threat either. They're not trying to export Xi Jinping thought or communism to the rest of the world in any meaningful sense. So while the US Congress and US think tanks and US security hawks have become very focused on this economic challenge from China and the rapid expansion of the Chinese military and the threat that represents to US bases in Asia, it's not really clear what the threat to the US homeland is, right? And why would the US public, the US voters, want to pay the costs of trillions of dollars over decades for the sort of multi-spectrum competition that we saw between the US and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War? So I think that's a really sort of poorly understood and poorly studied issue that, to be honest, gets to the heart of this, because unless voters are willing to pay the bill of a decoupling of your economy, massive military expansion, potentially paying the bill of war against China in Asia, there isn't really any meaningful competition there.
The big difference between the Cold War and now is that in the Cold War era, for countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia generally, working with the United States was seeking American protection against the spread of communism and therefore communist subversion of their own government in Asia Pacific. Today, the American approach is not that any longer. It is called pivot to Asia, when in fact it was a policy of pivot to China. It's all about US-China competition and how the US should be working to preempt China challenging and seizing American global or at least regional hegemony in the region. Now, if you were running a country in the Asia-Pacific region, do you really want to be part of this American-led competition against China when it is not aimed at actually helping you, promoting you, or protecting you? Whereas previously in the Cold War, it was about at least protecting you, if not helping you to develop and advance in the way you wanted. Most of your countries in the East Asia region today want stability and order so that they can propel their economy forward after the model of success in Japan and Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong. And they would have loved to receive American support and cooperation in addition to security guarantee. If they are going to work in a way that would put them in a somewhat adversarial competitive relationship with China, they need American reassurance. They just are not getting that. And I think that is where the American approach is not very effective at the moment, even though there are potential for them to engage effectively with traditional American allies much more effectively.
So when American Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said over the weekend that the United States would stoutly defend its interests and maintain the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, you're not reassured. Countries in that region don't feel particularly reassured by that.
Well, what does that actually mean? When you have a president who clearly articulates that it is America first, and in fact, adversary second, and allies third, and you happen to be an ally, you are not finding it very reassuring when the US Secretary for War said that we are going to defend American interests in the region, potentially at the expense of allies' interests or not. Now that needs to be very, very clear. For the American allies to be supportive of American posturing, they need to be reassured that America will stand by them thick or thin.
What does that reassurance look like? Spell out what should America be doing to shore up its interests and those alliances?
Well, for example, if you want Malaysia, as in the visit that Donald Trump made to Malaysia, so that they actually want Malaysia to contribute to the economic partnership and potentially even in areas like rare earth, which is something that is going to put Malaysia not in the favored spot of China, then Malaysia will want to be sure that doing so will be something that is sustainable, and if there will be negative consequences from the Chinese side, the Americans can be counted on to compensate for that. If the Americans are looking at reducing economic dependency on China, then they will be looking at supporting Asian allies of the United States to develop economically and replace China as a source of supply of critical stuff. And that's not just talking about things like rare earth. You can be much more mundane items for the global supply chain. And if they face consequences with reprisals from China, what's Uncle Sam going to do about it? So if they get all those reassurances, I think they will get much more commitment on their part to work with the US. And again, I'm not seeing those being demonstrated yet.
But I actually don't think countries that ally with the US should be primarily seeking reassurance from the US. Obviously, we have to diplomatically manage our relationship with any US administration to get the maximum benefits for ourselves. But I actually think countries need to be doing more to look after their own security. I think they need to read the writing on the wall, right? Which is, as I said earlier, Trump as consequence of what's happening in America and the world, not as the cause. So I think we all need to just understand that the world is changing, that Japan, Korea, Australia, the UK, France, Germany, we need to pay more for our own defense. We need to thicken the relationships between ourselves as middle powers that are US allies without always going back through the mothership in Washington.
I want to end on this idea of the threat of China, because here in Europe, we're speaking in the UK, Russia is a sort of military threat, and that feels imminent. There's a war in Ukraine, and NATO is mobilizing to try and make sure that that war doesn't expand further into Europe. China is a hard military threat. I think for people in Europe, it feels quite far away. That probably feels a bit more immediate if you're in Taiwan. But China is a threat in other ways, and we are in the midst of an ongoing spy crisis here in the UK, where 2 MPs were caught spying for China, and there's a lot of going back and forth over whether China is a national security threat and how we can prosecute them. We've also had just today news of University Sheffield Hallam, whose researcher, an academic who was researching rights abuses in Xinjiang, was suppressed by Chinese security officials and lots of sort of back channel negotiating. China is a threat to the Western way of life, right? How can the West combat that?
China is a security threat to its neighbors. ask people in Taiwan if you have any questions about that. China is not a traditional security threat to European countries. But China is a country with a global vision and global ambition, not regional. If you look at what Xi Jinping actually says, nowhere does Xi Jinping actually say that he wants to establish Chinese regional hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. What he wants is to deliver what he would call the democratization of international relations for the world as a whole, in order to forge what he would like to call the common destiny for humankind. It's completely global. And that democratization of international relations means China, first and foremost, pivot its foreign policy to the global south, win over support from the global south, which is the majority, is the overwhelming majority of member states at the United Nations and also of global population. With China being from their perspective, natural leader. And with the democratization of international relations, it means the global south will become the dominant force at the United Nations and international organizations and completely transform the Western-dominated liberal international order into a new international order that puts the interests of the global south as represented by China first, which means putting China's interests first. It will be a world order in which autocrats and autocracies can feel incredibly safe and relaxed. It is therefore a world order that is not so comfortable for democracies, democrats, and human rights advocates. Now, does that constitute a threat to our national security? Depends on whether we see defending our way of life and our beliefs in democracies and human rights are fundamental to our national security or not.
I think Steve makes some really good points, which I broadly agree with. I mean, one point of clarification I would say is I think the China challenge isn't so much for democracies, but it's about liberal values. There are plenty of illiberal democracies in the world, India, Hungary, others that in many ways are quite comfortable with Chinese global leadership. They may have some of their own bilateral issues with China. But I think Steve is right to focus on the global challenge or threats that China would represent to the UK interests. And one problem with the debate in the UK is there's a risk we let the tail wag the dog, right? So we're talking about this question of whether China should be allowed to build a new embassy, about this particular espionage case, and that's determining our China policy. But it should be that our thinking about the challenge that China represents to UK interests over the next coming decades determines how we approach the embassy and the challenge of Chinese espionage, which is a real one. So I think we need to flip things on their head and think much more long term. In terms of what we can do, right, I think there's a lot we can do. The world is challenging and concerning, but there are real opportunities here. I think the first is the UK and other countries in the world that most closely share our national interests and our political system and ways of doing things. We need to cooperate much more closely with France, with Germany, with the EU, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, other middle powers that are open trading economies, democracies, etc. We need to work together much more, talking about how to manage the US, as well as talking about how to manage China on lots of different fronts. That's number one. And number two, I think, as Steve mentioned, there's this competition for interest in the global south, developing countries, which is the majority of the world's countries, the majority of the world's populations, many of whom people and leaders feel that they don't have a fair say in the world, that it's a world built for Western interests, which is basically true. So we need to reach out to them too and say, look, we understand your concerns and we're willing actually potentially to give up some power and work with you because we accept the world has to change and it's better to have them on side with us rather than force them into China's camp effectively. So I think it comes back to understanding that the world is changing quite dramatically. It's very disconcerting and destabilizing, but it also represents an opportunity for all countries to make of it what they will rather than just leave it to the big boys to shape the world in their own interests.
Steve Tsang from SOAS and Ben Bland from Chatham House, thank you very much for joining me on Battle Lines.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Before we go, I want to share some feedback that we've had on last week's episode about Sudan. Adam Moran on Spotify says, another thought-provoking and interesting episode. John on YouTube asks, I understand why world leaders are silent, but where is the outrage of Western students and the protester class generally? And finally, Robert emailed in to say, I enjoyed the podcast and I'm interested in learning more about what's happening in Sudan. But he wants to know more about the details of the situation in Al Fasher and said that we went a bit too macro. Well, Robert, I recommend checking out some of the Telegraph's coverage. We shared some links in the last episode's show notes and we go into lots more detail there. Thanks as ever for sharing your feedback. We'll be back again on Friday. Until then, goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.